Okay, so today, guys, we're going to finish up our notes for the Revolutionary War. We had been talking so far how the war started out very poorly for the Americans, how they lost pretty much every battle that they fought in for the first year and a half. And they were able to get a couple of significant wins. We talked about the crossing of the Delaware, that sneak attack on Trenton, New Jersey, where they were able to capture about 1,500 Hessian mercenaries. And then we looked at the battle that is considered to be the turning point in the war, and that is the Battle of Saratoga. And that is the first major battle that the Americans were won. And it is also the battle that convinced European countries that the Americans had a chance at defeating the British. And so they decided that they would come to the aid of the Americans. And we see France and Spain and the Netherlands all declare war on England back in Europe. And they force England to fight a war on two fronts. They have to fight a war in Europe as well as a war in America against the Continental Army. We're also going to see that France does send aid to America. They send part of their navy as well as some troops to help the Americans fight against the British in this Revolutionary War. Before we get to that, though, we're going to talk about the impact of the war on a few different groups. First of all, there were African Americans living in the colonies at this time, many of which were slaves, and some were free. Most African Americans who participated in the war fought on the side of the British, and the reason being that the British promised freedom for these slaves upon the completion of the war. So that's a pretty good incentive, and you can understand why so many of them would want to take advantage of that. Washington had a policy at the beginning of the war that African Americans were not allowed to be a part of the army. That did change over time. And what we see is that 5,000 eventually do serve under Washington. For women had to take on some added responsibility with the men away at war fighting. The women, of course, had to do not only their role, which was considerable, taking care of the home, but they had to take on the responsibilities of the men as well. In addition to that, many women supported the war effort with the making of clothes and other supplies, and a few even disguised themselves as men, and they fought in the war. Native Americans, for the most part, stayed out of the war. However, those who did fight mostly helped the British, and the reason being is because they saw the American colonists as the ones who were continually pushing westward and pushing Native Americans off their land. They know that back in 1763 that the king had issued this proclamation of 1763, which forbid Americans from moving westward. And they thought that if the British were able to win this war, that they would be able to stem the tide of Americans who were continuing again to push west. So most who participated fought again alongside the British. The effects of the war at home were considerable, and we're going to see great economic difficulty. There was an economic depression that happened as a result of this war, which is just a shrinking of the economy over a period of time. And many people faced extreme financial hardships during this time. The Continental Congress had to come up with a way to pay for this war. And they began to issue their own currency. So if they were going to be their own country, they weren't going to go by British currency anymore. And so they started issuing their own currency again called Continentals. And these Continentals ended up being pretty much worthless. In fact, it is said that they were not even worth the paper that they were printed on. Many of the colonists even didn't want to do business with the Continental Congress. They didn't want to sell them war supplies or war materials because they were afraid that they would never be compensated for these materials. In addition to that, we see inflation, which is common during war. And inflation is often caused when supply does not meet the demand, meaning when the amount of something available is not able to meet the amount that people want. And we see that happen during this war. So because of that, prices go up. When there's not enough of something, you have to raise prices so that it doesn't get sold out, so you don't run out of it. So price of essentials, things that people need to feed their family, went up exponentially. We see the price of corn, flour, and beef go up. Corn by 10,000%, flour by 15,000%. Flour, of course, used to make bread, and then beef went up by 33,000%. So buying a hamburger during the Revolutionary War would have been incredibly expensive. So there was great economic hardship that was faced during this war as well. We're going to skip now towards the end. So we looked at the Battle of Saratoga, which happened in 1777. After that, the war really did not go very well for the Americans. There were a lot more losses, to be honest with you, but they were holding their own. And again, they were accomplishing their goal of making the war last. They just weren't losing. And by 1781, what we start to see again is the tide really turn in favor of the Americans. The French show up and provide the help that is needed to end this war. The British had started a new strategy, and what they had done is they had started in the South, and they thought, well, we'll just conquer these colonies one by one as we head north. And it started off going okay. They were able to conquer Georgia pretty quickly, but they started to meet some resistance in South Carolina and North Carolina. And through this resistance, their forces were greatly weakened. The British general who was in charge of this army, his name was General Cornwallis. And what he decides to do is, I'm going to take my army to Virginia. We're going to find the British Navy, and the Navy can provide us with reinforcements so that we can resume our war effort. Now, this proved to be a fatal mistake. So what General Cornwallis does is he leads his army to Yorktown, which we can see down here on this map. And Yorktown, guys, is a peninsula in Virginia. Now, if you know what a peninsula is, you know that it is surrounded on three sides by water. And then you have one side of land. And what that does, guys, is it effectively cuts off routes of escape. He, again, expected the British Navy to be waiting there for him, and he expected reinforcements. But instead, what he finds is the French Navy. The French Navy had shown up. They had chased off the British Navy. And so their escape by sea was completely blocked. And Washington, along with the help of some of his French friends, blocked the only route of escape by land. So the British forces at Yorktown are completely surrounded. And after a few weeks of what we would call a siege, the British are forced to surrender. This, guys, proves to be the last major battle of the war. At this point, the British people have lost their will to fight. They believe now that the cost of the war far outweighs any benefits that they would get by winning. The king wants to continue fighting. He doesn't want to give up, but Parliament, the British legislature, says, no, it is time to sue for peace. And since the British are so eager for peace, the Americans get much of what they want in the treaty that ends the war. This treaty is signed on April 15th of 1783, and it is called the Treaty of Paris. And this officially ends the war, and the United States of America becomes officially recognized as their own independent country. Now, there were a number of different parts of the treaty. We're going to look at 6. The first 3 on the left-hand side were all parts that were done by both sides. And the parts, the 4, 5, and 6 on the right side, were not really honored by either side. So, number 1, the United States gets recognized as a free and independent nation, complete with all of the rights and responsibilities of all other nations in the world. Okay. Number 2, the United States borders are set, and you can see those down here in the map. Okay. So you can see to the west, the border of the United States becomes the Mississippi River. To the north, you can see the Great Lakes provide much of that border. And then up to the north of that, we see what is modern day Canada. This is still controlled by the British, by the way. You can see here down to the south that Florida belongs still to the Spanish. This green part here, these are the borders of the United States set by the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The third part of the treaty is that fishing rights were guaranteed to Americans off of the New England coast. Now, these are some of the best fishing grounds in the entire world, and were very important to the United States economy, especially the economy of the New England, what would now be states. Number 4, each side said that they would repay their war debt. Number 5, each side said that they would return any captured slaves to their owners. And then number 6, Americans agreed that they would return any property that had belonged to loyalists, people who stayed loyal to England. they had agreed that they would return the property to these loyalists at the end of the war. Now, again, 4, 5, and 6 were parts of the treaty that were really not honored by either side. Parts 1 through 3 were honored by both sides. And that kind of brings us, guys, to why the Americans were able to win the war. Again, we looked at this on paper at the beginning. It did not seem possible that the Americans would be able to win this war. However, again, they were able to come out with this win. So why is that the case? Well, number one is home field advantage. If you've ever paid attention to sports, you know that home teams often win games, or teams often have a better record at home than they do on the road. So Americans fought at home and they knew the lay of the land. And in addition to that, when you fight for your home, you tend to fight a little bit harder. And we see that in this war for sure. Number two, there's this patriotic spirit, this belief that Americans were fighting for a cause that was greater than themselves. Number three, the Americans definitely did have good leadership. Washington was far from perfect. However, he was able to look at this war, at this situation, and he was able to swallow his pride in a number of situations and do what was best for his army and for his country as a whole. So skilled leadership was important. And then finally, guys, and this one cannot be emphasized enough, help from France, Spain, and the Netherlands. Foreign help was essential for the Americans in winning the war. And that, guys, brings us to the end of the American Revolution. Please make sure, again, that you have taken notes on all of these slides, and we will begin our review process tomorrow.